Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be taking a look at a very interesting book. It's one of the most compelling books I've seen in years and possibly my entire life. It's extremely interesting and I know you're going to enjoy it. My guest today is Dr. Anthony Feinstein. Dr. Feinstein is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto and he's a neuropsychiatrist. His research and clinical work focus on people with multiple sclerosis, traumatic brain injury, and conversion disorder. He has undertaken a number of studies investigating how frontline journalists are affected by their work covering war and man-made and natural disasters. He is the author of Shooting War, 18 Profiles of Conflict Photographers. Dr. Anthony Feinstein, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you.
And I want to be sure and show your book now to make sure that we have an opportunity to let our viewers see the cover, but it is really a compelling book. It's a very interesting book. It's frightening to a large degree too because of the violence that's involved in it, but it certainly gives us an keen insight into the human nature, if you will, so to speak. But again, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And let's talk about how did you get involved in working on a book like this?
So I've studied frontline journalists for about 20 years. I had a patient in my clinical practice in the late 1990s who was a war journalist, a very interesting patient. She got me interested in the topic. I wrote a grant application about a year before 9/11, sent it to a group in Washington, D.C. called the Freedom Forum, and they funded what turned out to be the very first study looking at the psychological effects of war on war journalists. And we showed that, not surprisingly, this group has quite a high rate of post-traumatic stress disorder, and they were also prone to develop depression, given the dangers of their work. The study was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and that became the impetus for me to do further work. I looked at embedded journalists in the Iraq War that started in 2003. I got a commission from the UNESCO to look at Mexican journalists covering the drug wars in their country. And so bit by bit, I've been doing a series of studies focusing on journalists who do very dangerous work. The group of journalists who've always interested me the most were the photojournalists, the photographers. And that's how this book came about. I pitched an idea to the editor of the Globe and Mail newspaper in Toronto, and he liked it. I said I would like to write on photojournalists, looking at how the work has affected them. And he said, sure. So he gave me a slot, one essay a month in the Globe and Mail for 12 months, 2,000 words on a photojournalist of my choice. And I went around interviewing some of the great photojournalists.
Well, we're going to look at some of your photos right now. We'll take a sample of 5 to see, get an overview of this, and they're just so compelling. Again, I think that word gets overused a bit, yes. But it really is a remarkable book. And now the first one's an American soldier who slumped against a gravel wall.
Yes.
Who is a soldier? What were the conditions? What happened to this soldier eventually?
Right. So that was a photograph taken by the British photojournalist Tim Hetherington. And it's a soldier who was in Afghanistan, in a place called Korangal, a very dangerous part of Afghanistan. And Hetherington was with this particular American unit for a prolonged period. You might have seen a documentary that came out called Restrepo, which featured his work and another journalist called Sebastian Junger. And so Hetherington got this photograph after the soldier had returned to base, and it shows the exhaustion of combat. If you look at the man's face, it really tells a story. It's a very powerful photograph. It won a World Press Photo Award for Tim Hetherington. And he spent a prolonged time with this group. Very, very dangerous time for him. Soldiers were getting killed and wounded. He photographed all of that. As I say, they made a documentary that highlighted the dangers faced by the soldiers, and I might say the dangers faced by the photographers in getting the story. Ultimately, Hetherington went back to different wars. So after Afghanistan, he ended up going to the conflict in Libya, where it was sadly he was killed in a mortar attack. And so the story has a very tragic ending, obviously, because a photographer paid with his life for the story.
As you look at this picture, what do you see on that soldier's face? Do you see shock, disbelief, weariness,
Yeah.
just or disgust with war, or how do you read him?
Well, I think it's such a powerful photograph because you can read in many things into his face. I mean, there's exhaustion over there. When I look at it, I see a sense of horror almost. I have to be careful that I don't overinterpret it, but one can easily understand the emotions given what he's endured. You should see that photograph in the context of the documentary Restrepo, because then you can see what these soldiers endured. I mean, they lost buddies. This was a very difficult assignment. That part of Afghanistan was considered amongst the most dangerous in the entire country. And so there was a high mortality rate and a morbidity rate amongst the soldiers there. And Hetherington and his colleague Sebastian Junger were very much part of that. And you could capture the immediacy of the moment. I think that's what makes it such a powerful photograph. He was there and he photographed it in the moment. That's what gives it its drama.
It certainly does. And to me, when I looked at it too, it struck me as that so often you hear people when they're talking about building up for war. We heard of World War I, we heard of World War II from all sides, talking about it was be a glorious victory. It's a great honor to go off to war. And when you talk to people who have been in firefights, people who have been on the front lines, they don't feel like it's a great, glorious honor. Now, some probably do. A few probably really enjoy it, but most of them are frightened to death. They're not sure what the outcome is going to be. They become numb. They become insensitive, or desensitized, I should say, to the whole situation. And it really is not the glory of war, shall we say. And as I looked at it, that's just my own perception.
No, I think that's right. I think it's the horror of warfare.
The horror of war,
the pity and the pity of warfare. And I think once again, what also gives this photograph such gravitas is that it's slightly blurred. It's it's not in perfect focus, which also captures the immediacy of the moment. So on multiple levels, it's an amazing photograph. And then the photograph takes on this sense of added pathos, because if you know who took it, you know then ultimately Hetherington paid with his life in another war. And so, here we have a photographer, immensely gifted, a very creative man, more than just a photographer, who is now no longer alive to share his gifts with us. War has claimed another photographer.
It certainly has. Well, now, we think back to the mid-90s, 94, 95, along that period. We remember the horrific, terrible disaster that took place in Rwanda between the Hutus and the Tutsis. And the next photo deals with that, with Rwandan refugees. What is that photo about?
So that's a photograph taken by Sebastião Salgado, a Brazilian photographer now living in Paris. And it comes from a series called Migrations. And so, as Salgado explained to me, he takes a long time on a particular project. So he can spend years on a theme. So, for example, his work on migrations could take 7-8 years. He goes back repeatedly for prolonged periods following migrants. And this particular photograph, as you said, comes from a refugee camp that sprung up because of the ethnic cleansing and the genocide in Rwanda. And so Salgado spent a prolonged time photographing the refugees. It was dangerous work. He works alone. He doesn't have his little army that's protecting him. It's just him with his camera. And he spends a prolonged time in very difficult circumstances. There's enormous misery, as you can understand. There's a lot of death and dying. There's huge numbers of people who are traumatized, and he's day in and day out photographing it. And as he explained to me, at the end of his work with migrations, he felt exhausted, just physically and emotionally exhausted. His health collapsed. He had to take a break from photography. He had to go and restore his health by doing something completely different. And so you see, in his case, a different kind of toll taken on the photographer. This is one of attrition, of just wearing the photographer down, day after day, week after week, month after month, photographing humans in extremis, in the worst possible circumstances. And of course, the photographer is not immune to what he sees and what he witnesses. And there's a toll that can come with that. And Salgado speaks very movingly of how this work affected him, and he had to take a break from what he was doing.
Even though this occurred back in the mid-90s, when you look at that with the camp and that type of thing, you just envision today the Democratic Republic of Congo or South Sudan or some other area where there are refugee camps set up. And of course, we see today the United Nations High Commission for Refugees is helping over 65 million refugees a year to try to just maintain a basic standard of living so they hopefully someday can return to their own homes and rebuild their homes or get their lives back to normal.
Yeah. I mean, that photograph is for the ages. I mean, that's a photograph that will never age because it shows the consequences of being a refugee, of migration, and as you so clearly point out, this has probably never been more relevant now with these huge numbers of migrants just trying to escape countries in conflict. And so you're right, this is a photograph that goes back 20 years, but I think it's an eternal image.
And the next photo is of Kosovo, I believe,
right.
or Kosovo Albanians, right?
Yes.
What does this picture depict?
So that was a photograph taken by Alexandra Boulard. She too is no longer alive. She's a French photojournalist. She didn't die in combat. She died from a medical illness, but she died young. And I think it's the most powerful photograph because you see two young women smiling, and at first glance, it looks like a happy photograph. And then, you look a little further, and this is against the backdrop of houses that are burning. And so it's an example of ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. And so at that moment in time, there's one community who's smiling and happy, whereas the other one has lost everything. They've lost their homes, they're displaced, they've been ethnically cleansed. And as I say, go forward 6 months or go back 6 months, you might find the complete opposite, that the people who are smiling and laughing have now lost their homes. And it's their young men who've been killed, and they've suffered the consequences of ethnic cleansing. So I think in one photograph, you really see the horrors of civil war in the Balkans, of how communities turned on one another, our neighbors started to attack one another, how civil society just came apart. And there you see it. You're captured with such a deft touch with a single photograph. So it's a very powerful image, which at first glance looks like quite a benign image.
It certainly does. Yes, it looks very happy until you notice the smoke in the background.
Exactly.
And I guess it goes to show, too, that how communities that have been living side by side for decades, maybe centuries, who all of a sudden, for one reason or another, turn on one another, and it's as though the past didn't matter.
Yes.
What they're doing is living in the present and projecting into the future, and it's chaos, devastation,
yes.
hatred towards one another, and we see that in other parts of the world. It is happening.
Yeah, well, in this one photograph, you see the story of the Balkans. There it is, as you say, communities basically disintegrating after, decades of coexistence. Interestingly enough, for me to write the essay on Alexandra Boulard, I had to interview her mother. And her mom told me that this was one of her daughter's favorite photographs, I think, because it's just such a powerful image.
You're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website, you like our shows, you want to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided as a public service at no cost to help people better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at a very, very dangerous area and one that's mesmerizing and compelling, and it's to look at photojournalists in war zones. And my guest today is Dr. Anthony Feinstein, who is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto and the author of Shooting War, 18 Profiles of Conflict Photographers. And this is just a remarkable book. It's just absolutely incredible. Dr. Feinstein, moving right along here, the next one, we're still in the Balkans,
yes.
and this is a street scene. What does this photo tell us?
So this is an iconic photograph taken by the American photojournalist Ron Haviv. And once again, it's a photograph that is focuses on ethnic cleansing. So what you see in it is Serb paramilitary, a rogue unit run by a war criminal by the name of Arkan, and some of his militia have killed Bosnian civilians. And Haviv captured this remarkable moment in which you see one of the militia kicking one of the dead civilians. So you see this man with a cigarette nonchalantly in his hand as he puts the boot into an elderly civilian whom they've just killed. And Haviv took this photograph at extraordinary personal risk to himself, as you can imagine, because the militia who had perpetrated this atrocity were everywhere. They did not want him to take the photograph. And when they actually became aware that he had taken this photograph, they wanted the film, they wanted the camera, but he managed to smuggle This is in the pre-digital era. So he managed to smuggle the film back to the United States, where it was published to immediate acclaim and horror. In time, this photograph was used at the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague as evidence of war crimes and atrocities and ethnic cleansing. And Haviv became something of a hero to the Bosnians because of this photograph. This photograph became, in a sense, a symbol of their resistance and what they had endured. But like everything in this book, these photographs come at a great personal price. And when it became apparent to the Serbian warlord, Arkan, who really was a career criminal, that this photograph had made its way back and had been published, he put a bounty on Haviv's head and would, I think, almost surely have killed him. Arkan subsequently was assassinated himself. But Haviv didn't leave the Balkans. He continued to work, just trying to stay away from these militia who were looking for him. He continued to do this work, this compelling drive to still bear witness.
Exactly. And when they're bearing witness, when these wartime photographers, do any of them feel like they have a responsibility, a professional duty to take the photo, but do they ever feel like intervening? Do they feel they have a moral obligation to be involved in trying to stop the atrocity? They probably couldn't do it.
Yes.
But do they have that yin-yang pull on their conscience?
I mean, it's such a good question, because in relation to this photograph, I mean, Haviv told me that he had seen civilians executed before, and he hadn't photographed that. And he had made a vow to himself that should he ever come across a scene like this again, he would bear witness. He would take that photograph. And I think that became the compelling reason why, notwithstanding the grave danger that he faced personally in the moment, he took this photograph. He felt compelled to tell the story and to show the world what was going on. I think what you've touched on with your question is something called moral injury.
Yes.
How do journalists behave at a moment of great drama and great danger when they have to make a decision? Do they intervene? Don't they intervene? Who do they help? Don't they help? Those kind of decisions can be so hard to make in the moment, given the risks that they face. And if they feel they don't make the right decision, looking back, they can express a sense of moral injury, which is, somehow I let myself down. I betrayed my moral compass. I behaved in a way that doesn't do justice to how I see the world. And that can take a number of forms. It can be through, well, I didn't do anything, an act of omission. I should have done something, but I didn't. Or else I did something, but I did the wrong thing. I made the wrong call. And so you see these multiple difficult decisions that they have to make. And if they don't make the right call as they see it, they can end up with this moral injury, which is associated with feelings of guilt and shame. And moral injury by itself is not a mental illness, but the military know this, that moral injury can become the conduit to things like post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. So the military have been aware of moral injury going all the way back to soldiers coming out of Vietnam, the war in Afghanistan. The military, the young men would come home and feel that somehow they might have betrayed their moral compass by things that they did or didn't do in the theater of war. So moral injury is well known to the military, but not well known to journalists. But it's a very interesting question with respect to journalists.
It certainly is. And of course, many people find themselves in a situation where it's either nonfeasance, misfeasance, or malfeasance. And to make the choice, it's a dilemma. It really is.
And it's done in these really fraught situations,
which
is in the battlefield with life and death issues at stake, and they have to decide what to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, the last one we have is a bedroom.
Yes.
What does this photo of the bedroom tell us?
So I think these are such powerful photographs because looking at it, what's the relevance of a bedroom to war? But it's a photograph taken by the Australian photographer Ashley Gilbertson, who was embedded with the American soldiers in the Iraq War, the Battle for Fallujah. And he wanted to go and photograph a scene in a minaret. He had heard that one of the insurgents was firing on soldiers from a minaret. And so he thought, well, this is really of interest because, you shouldn't be using places of worship to wage war. The commanding officer that he was with said, you can't go by yourself. You have to take an escort. He went with 2 soldiers. They were climbing up the steps of the minaret. They thought that the insurgent was dead, but he wasn't. He fired shots down the stairway, and the soldier in front of Gilbertson was killed. As a result of that, Gilbertson developed crippling guilt. He blamed himself. I think it was misplaced guilt, but he blamed himself for the death of the Marine, and he struggled with the aftermath of this incident. as a way, I think, of dealing with his own private grief, he embarked on this remarkable project in which he went around filming the bedrooms of fallen soldiers. So he would, speak to their parents, get access to the house, and take a photograph of a bedroom of a fallen soldier, be it American or Canadian. And so what you see in these black and white photographs are these very private spaces of young men who are not coming home from war. And what's so touching about these images, you see how the parents, in many cases, have kept the bedroom completely unchanged. This is the way their kid left the room before they went off to Iraq and Afghanistan. And while we think of these young men as warriors, what we see in their bedroom is something very different. We see their childhood mementos, maybe even a cuddly toy left on the bed. In some cases, we even see the unmade bed just before the young man went off. And so this is a very powerful anti-war document. I think this is the pain of war. There can be nothing greater, I think, than a parent's pain having lost a child. And Gilbertson gives voice to this in these black and white, quiet photographs of bedrooms. It's a remarkable document of the cost that comes with warfare.
And before we went on the set, you were telling, we don't have that photo available, but you were talking about a soldier who stepped on a landmine, an IED, or something to that effect. Tell that story. That was also very, very riveting. So
that's the South African photojournalist João Silva, and he was on assignment in Afghanistan for the New York Times when he stepped on a landmine. The injuries that he sustained were grievous. He realized immediately, being a veteran of many wars, that he had lost his legs. And the blast threw him to the ground. And the very first thing that he did was he took photographs. And as he told me, he said, his entire career, he had been photographing other people who had been hurt, killed, maimed by war. And now it was his chance, and he wanted to capture the moment. And so he took these 3 frames before the medics rushed to him, knocked aside his camera, and started to work on him. So you get these remarkable 3 images taken in the immediate aftermath of a photojournalist who's just stood on a landmine, life-threatening injuries, legs shredded, and the very first thing he does is to take a photograph. Intriguingly, and thankfully, João Silva survived because of the skills of modern-day military medicine. There's a very famous photographer by the name of Robert Capa. He's a legend within war photography. Capa had a similar injury back in Indochina, many years back in the 1950s. Capa died from an injury like this because battlefield medicine wasn't as sophisticated as it is now. João Silva survived, and he's still working to this day as a photographer, which is remarkable. But what's intriguing about him, well, there are many things that are intriguing, but when he was brought to Bethesda for his rehabilitation, a long and painful rehabilitation, he never showed signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. There was a great psychological resilience to him. He told me that the doctors would say to the students, the residents, go and talk to that man, try and find out what is it about his psychological makeup that has left him resilient to something like PTSD. How can you learn from someone like this? So it's a remarkable story on many levels.
It certainly is. Well, Dr. Anthony Feinstein, everyone should take a look at this. And I think the message that came across for me, and probably you and many others too, that war is not glorious, war is not great. There are losers, and one day you may win, the next day you may lose, and it is just a dreadful situation. Nobody wins from a war generally over the long run, but it's a fascinating book, and it's one that I'm sure that many folks in your field and people who are diplomats and what have you will take a look at it, and will certainly look at it with a keen eye, and hopefully it will help shape their opinions and their policies in the future. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and very informative program.
Thank you for your interest.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.